The committee chamber was buzzing. Reporters flipped through notepads, cameras rolled, and aides whispered behind stacks of paper as one of the most unusual confrontations in Congress was about to begin. Everyone knew the session would be heated. After all, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had just introduced one of her boldest legislative proposals yet. But no one in that room knew how the hearing would unfold. No one expected that Senator John Kennedy, with his slow Louisiana drawl and unshakable patience, was about to turn the entire atmosphere upside down simply by doing one thing: reading her bill out loud. Now, to understand why this moment captured the nation's attention, you have to rewind just a bit. For months, AOC had been pushing what she framed as a visionary piece of legislation, a sweeping proposal that promised to reshape America's economy, environment, and even its cultural norms. Her allies called it a New Deal for the future. Her critics called it a fantasy wish list with no price tags. The stage was set for conflict, but no one anticipated just how theatrical it would become. The hearing began the way these things usually do. AOC defended her bill with the kind of fiery passion her supporters adored. She spoke about saving the planet, fighting inequality, and building a society that future generations would thank us for. She painted vivid pictures of green energy jobs, universal programs, and bold reforms. The room was filled with applause from her allies and stern headshakes from her opponents. But Kennedy? He sat quietly at the end of the long wooden table, listening. He didn't interrupt, didn't scowl, didn't roll his eyes. Instead, he shuffled through the thick stack of papers, the text of AOC's bill, marking passages with a pen. Those who knew him well recognized the look. Kennedy wasn't preparing to debate. He was preparing to dismantle. Finally, when his turn came, the chairman handed him the microphone. Kennedy adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began not with an argument, but with a question that made the room lean in closer. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice low but cutting to the chatter, "would you mind if I simply read a few sections of your bill, just so the American people can hear in plain English?" The question hung in the air like smoke. AOC nodded, confident. After all, she had written a proposal with boldness and conviction. Why fear having it read aloud? But then came the moment no one would forget. Kennedy began to read. His delivery was steady, deliberate, almost like a storyteller reciting lines from a script. Yet the words on the page weren't soaring speeches or catchy slogans. They were technical mandates, sweeping guarantees, and staggering commitments that sounded very different when spoken slowly without spin to a silent room. Line after line rolled off his tongue. Provisions about eliminating fossil fuels within years. Guarantees of government-funded programs stretching into nearly every corner of life. Even clauses that critics said bordered on impossible. The more he read, the quieter the room became. Reporters stopped scribbling. Staffers exchanged glances. Even some of AOC's allies shifted in their seats. Kennedy wasn't mocking, wasn't attacking. He was simply reading. But the effect was devastating. What looked inspiring on a press release sounded overwhelming in plain speech. What felt ambitious in a rally sounded impractical under the fluorescent lights of Congress. And then, with perfect timing, Kennedy paused. He looked up, his eyes sweeping across the silent room, and let the words sink in. It was in that silence, the silence that followed AOC's boldest proposal being spoken aloud without embellishment, that everyone realized something unforgettable had just happened. The bill wasn't being debated. It was being revealed. Kennedy lowered the stack of papers for just a moment, letting his first round of words settle in the minds of everyone listening. He didn't raise his voice, didn't wave his hands, didn't launch into an angry tirade. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, folded one page over another, and with the calm patience of a small-town lawyer, said softly, "Let's keep going, shall we?" And he did. This time, the words grew heavier. He read a section that promised economic security for all who are unable or unwilling to work. The phrase rolled off his tongue slowly, each word separated by just enough pause to give the audience time to process it. And sure enough, whispers began. Some in the crowd chuckled under their breath. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The phrase, buried in the bill's text, had suddenly become a headline in real time. AOC leaned forward, her expression tightening. She raised her hand as if to interject, but Kennedy wasn't grandstanding. He was quoting. It's hard to argue with your own words when they're being read aloud directly from your proposal. Next, he read passages about retrofitting every single building in America, eliminating traditional vehicles in favor of electric alternatives, and guaranteeing education, healthcare, housing, and even food as basic government promises. Each sentence was read in that same slow Louisiana cadence, where the power wasn't in what he said, but in how plainly he said it. What made the moment extraordinary wasn't that Kennedy was exposing something no one had seen before. Everyone had access to the bill. It was public. But few had ever sat still and heard it read aloud, line by line, stripped of slogans and catchphrases. Hearing it in that setting made the promises sound less like visionary goals and more like impossible demands. At one point, Kennedy looked up from the text and offered a brief comment. Not a debate, just an observation. Now, I don't mean to be ugly here, he said, his voice even impolite. But if I'm reading this right, we're talking about reimagining the entire United States economy within 10 years. That's like promising to rebuild Rome in a weekend, except you want to do it on someone else's credit card. The room erupted, not in laughter, not in applause, but in stunned murmurs. The analogy hit hard. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Cameramen zoomed closer. AOC finally leaned toward her microphone. Her voice was sharp, determined. She insisted that Kennedy was cherry-picking, that the bill represented a bold vision for justice and survival, not a list of impossible tasks. She argued that critics always mocked big ideas before they became history. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He simply nodded, returned to the paper, and kept reading. Another line, another sweeping guarantee, another silence falling over the room. With each passage, the atmosphere shifted. What had started as a rallying showcase for AOC's vision was now turning into a public trial of her own words. The contrast was undeniable. One lawmaker speaking passionately in broad strokes, the other calmly reciting the details with no filter, no spin, just plain ink on paper. It was a strategy so disarmingly simple that it felt brilliant. Kennedy didn't need to insult. He didn't need to posture. All he had to do was keep reading, and the weight of the bill would do the heavy lifting for him. By the time he set down the next page, the silence was deafening again. AOC's allies were shifting uncomfortably. Her opponents were smirking. And the American people watching at home had only one thought. If the bill sounds as overwhelming when read out loud, and the silence spoke louder than any argument ever could, how would it ever work in practice? Kennedy looked up, adjusted his glasses, and gave a faint smile. He hadn't finished. Not by a long shot. Kennedy flipped to another page, this one marked with more scribbles and underlines than the rest. He tapped the paper lightly with his pen, the sound echoing just enough in the microphone to draw everyone's eyes back to him. He didn't rush. He let the silence build, because silence, in that moment, was his ally. Now, here's the part, Kennedy said slowly, where things get real interesting. The audience leaned forward. Even AOC sat straighter, bracing herself. Kennedy cleared his throat and began again, his tone flat, almost clinical, like a teacher reading through a homework assignment. This proposal would require large-scale investment in infrastructure, manufacturing, energy efficiency, sustainable farming, and universal access programs, with no clear funding mechanism identified. He paused, looked up, then gave one of his trademark half-smiles. Translation, he said, it costs money, a lot of it. The remark earned a ripple of laughter from the audience. Nervous laughter, the kind that happens when everyone knows the point is cutting deeper than humor. Kennedy didn't linger. He pressed on, flipping through estimates that had been floated by economists, think tanks, and fiscal analysts. One estimate puts the cost north of $90 trillion over 10 years, Kennedy said. That's 90 with a T. He leaned back and let the number hang in the air. 90 trillion. Reporters blinked. Some even looked at each other, mouthing the figure as if to confirm they'd heard correctly. 90 trillion. More than 4 times the size of America's entire economy. Kennedy tilted his head, his voice softer now, but no less sharp. To put that in perspective, Congresswoman, if every man, woman, and child in this country wrote you a check today, every single one of us, We'd each have to cough up about $275,000 just to get started. Now, I'm no math professor, but I don't see that happening. The room broke again, not in loud applause, but in those small bursts of disbelief that ripple through a crowd when someone drops a statistic that can't easily be ignored. AOC gripped her microphone. Her response came quickly, passionate, practiced. She argued that the cost of inaction on climate change would be far greater than the cost of her bill. She said lives were at stake, that future generations would pay the real price if Congress refused to act boldly. Her words had power, but Kennedy wasn't trying to outmatch her passion. He knew passion was her strength. Instead, he played on his own, simple, relatable logic. He nodded respectfully as she spoke, then raised his hand slightly to continue. "Congresswoman, I don't question your intentions," he said evenly, "but I do question your math. Because if this bill doesn't say how it will be paid for, then it's not a plan. It's a wish list." The line landed like a gavel strike. Clear, undeniable, memorable. Kennedy picked the papers back up, running his finger down another section. "And unless I missed it," he said, "I don't see a funding mechanism spelled out anywhere in here. No tax structure, no revenue breakdown. Just big promises written in bold ink." He set the papers back down, folded his hands, and looked across the table at AOC. The silence that followed wasn't just about what had been said. It was about what hadn't been answered. In that moment, it wasn't Kennedy's voice that carried the room. It was the absence of one. The absence of clarity on the question every American watching wanted to know. How you pay for all of this? And until that question was answered, Kennedy knew, the silence would keep speaking louder than the bill itself. The silence was unbearable for AOC's side of the room. She leaned into her microphone, her voice rising with that unmistakable fire her supporters admired. "Senator Kennedy, with all due respect, this isn't about nickels and dimes. This is about survival. The climate crisis doesn't wait for a balance sheet. It doesn't stop because Wall Street gets nervous. This bill isn't just numbers. It's humanity's last chance to protect our children, our communities, our planet." Her words rang with conviction. Cameras zoomed in. Supporters in the back nodded vigorously. This was AOC at her strongest, turning technical criticism into a moral call to arms. She continued, her hands moving in sharp gestures. "Every time Congress has faced a historic challenge, whether it was the Great Depression, World War II, or civil rights, there are always people who said it was too expensive, that it couldn't be done. And yet, history remembers the ones who tried, not the ones who mocked on the sidelines. That's what this bill represents. Courage." The room stirred with applause from her allies. It was a rallying cry, a reminder of why her base adored her. Passion, vision, a refusal to back down. Kennedy waited patiently. He didn't interrupt. He didn't roll his eyes. He simply listened, hands folded, a faint smile playing on his lips, as though he'd heard this speech rehearsed a dozen times before. When the room finally quieted, he leaned into his microphone with deliberate calm. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice almost gentle, "nobody's saying you don't care. Nobody's saying you're not passionate. But passion doesn't keep the lights on. Passion doesn't put gas in the car. Passion doesn't pay the grocery bill." He paused just long enough for the words to sting. "What does," he continued, "is a plan. And if we're going to talk about saving the planet, the least we can do is start by telling the American people exactly how we intend to pay for it. Because right now, you're asking them to write a blank check, one bigger than anything this country's ever seen, without telling them who's cashing it." The contrast was electric. AOC's sweeping vision met Kennedy's grounded practicality. The back and forth was no longer just about the bill. It had become a clash of philosophies. AOC jumped back in. She insisted that transformational change had always come with risk, that costs were dwarfed by the stakes. "If your house was on fire, Senator," she said, leaning forward, "would you stop to calculate the water bill before grabbing a hose?" The line drew a burst of laughter and applause. It was clever, sharp, and delivered with perfect timing. For a moment, the energy shifted back her way, but Kennedy wasn't rattled. He chuckled softly, leaned back in his chair, and delivered the kind of comeback that didn't shout, it whispered. "Congresswoman," he said slowly, If my house was on fire, I'd sure want to know that the hose actually had water in it before I started waving it around. The laughter flipped. This time, it came from the side of the room. Even some reporters cracked smiles. The duel was tightening, each exchange sharper than the last. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He picked up the stack of papers again and tapped it with his finger. You've got vision, I'll give you that. But vision without details? That's not legislation, that's marketing. And the American people deserve more than a slogan when the price tag is $90 trillion. The silence returned, heavier than before. AOC had fire. Kennedy had patience. And in that chamber, patience was starting to feel like the sharper weapon. Kennedy lifted the papers again, flipping to another section marked with a sticky note. The silence in the room sharpened, everyone waiting for his next move. He cleared his throat, leaned into the microphone, and began reading with the same steady rhythm that had become his weapon of choice. This bill, he said, calls for retrofitting or replacing every building in the United States, commercial, residential, government, every last one. That's 140 million buildings, give or take. Offices, schools, hospitals, homes. Every single one. He let the words linger, glancing around the chamber. Now, I don't know about you, but I've seen how long it takes just to fix a leaky roof on a courthouse in Louisiana. And you're telling me we're going to rebuild the entire country in 10 years. The room erupted in chuckles and murmurs. Even some of the reporters who tried to stay neutral couldn't help but smirk. AOC jumped in quickly. She argued that bold goals always seemed unrealistic until people committed to them. That America had once built highways across the nation and put a man on the moon. If we can mobilize for war, Senator, we can mobilize for survival. She shot back, her voice sharp. Kennedy nodded politely. Fair enough. But those projects had budgets. They had plans. They had deadlines grounded in reality. This is like promising to paint the Sistine Chapel. Except you want to paint every house, every barn, every gas station, every outhouse in America, and you want to do it all in less time than it takes some folks to pay off a car loan. The comparison drew laughter again, but Kennedy wasn't done. He flipped to another section, his voice lowering as he read. Eliminating fossil fuels within a decade. He paused, then raised his eyebrows. Now, I don't know if y'all have filled up your gas tanks lately, but last I checked, 70% of this country still runs on fossil fuels. Planes, trucks, tractors, ships. You shut all that down in 10 years. And I reckon we're all going to be walking to work with lanterns in our hands like it's the 1800s. The imagery drew a ripple of laughter from the audience. Even a few staffers couldn't hide their grins. AOC, undeterred, leaned into her mic. Senator, the science is clear. Fossil fuels are destroying the planet. The transition won't be easy, but it's necessary. We've done hard things before. Kennedy gave her a respectful nod, then answered with a soft drawl that landed like a punch. Congresswoman, doing hard things is one thing. Doing impossible things is another. You don't get to change the laws of physics just because you write them down in a bill. The room grew still again. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it cut to the bone. Kennedy wasn't attacking her character. He was attacking the feasibility of her promises. Then he leaned forward, his hands resting on the stack of papers. Look, I appreciate vision. I appreciate optimism. But when you promise to rebuild every building in America, replace every car and every fossil fuel, and guarantee everything under the sun, all at once, you're not describing a plan. You're describing a fairy tale. And fairy tales are fine for bedtime, but they don't belong in the congressional record. The silence that followed was heavier than laughter, heavier than applause. It was a kind of silence that meant people were thinking, questioning, wondering if the grand promises could ever survive contact with reality. Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply stacked the pages neatly, folded his hands again, and waited. He knew the hardest part wasn't making the room laugh. It was making the room think. And on that count, he was winning. AOC leaned closer to her microphone, her tone shifting from defensive to accusatory. She narrowed her eyes at Kennedy and delivered her line with sharp precision. Senator, let's be honest. What you're really protecting here isn't the American people. It's the fossil fuel industry. It's the billionaires who profit off pollution. It's the corporations who keep us locked in the past. You don't want bold solutions because the status quo benefits your side of the aisle. The words landed with force. Supporters in the gallery clapped. It was a tried-and-true strategy. Shift the spotlight away from the bill itself and onto Kennedy's supposed motives. Turn the debate from feasibility into morality, because morality was AOC's battlefield. Kennedy sat still, his expression unchanged, like a man waiting for a storm to pass. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he let her finish, let the applause fade, let the silence creep back in. Then, in his familiar drawl, he leaned into the microphone. "Congresswoman," he said, almost softly, "I've been called a lot of things in my time, but a defender of billionaires ain't one of 'em. Where I come from, we don't have billionaires. We got farmers trying to keep their tractors running, small business owners trying to make payroll, and families praying their kids don't graduate college with a mortgage's worth of debt." The tone was steady, but it cut deeper than if he'd raised his voice. Kennedy shifted slightly, holding the papers in his hand like a prop. "You say I'm protecting the status quo. But what I'm really protecting," he said, pausing just long enough for emphasis, "is the taxpayer. Because at the end of the day, every promise in this bill, every guarantee, every shiny idea, it don't get paid for by billionaires. It gets paid for by regular folks. And they're the ones who can least afford it." The room grew quiet again. The moral accusation turned on its head. Kennedy wasn't painted as a villain. He was painting himself as a defender of ordinary people. He flipped to a passage of the bill again, reading aloud a clause about government-guaranteed jobs and health care. "Sounds good," he admitted. "Real good. But let me ask you this, Congresswoman. Who writes the check? Because when the bill comes due, it won't be the billionaires who feel the pinch. It'll be the waitress in Lafayette who's already working 2 jobs. It'll be the truck driver in Shreveport trying to pay off his rig. It'll be the school teacher in Baton Rouge hoping her pension is worth something when she retires." The words echoed with a raw simplicity that campaign slogans rarely captured. Kennedy wasn't quoting think tanks or financial reports. He was putting faces to the numbers. And those faces weren't Wall Street tycoons. They were the American middle class. AOC tried to interject, insisting the wealthy could and should pay more, that redistribution was the only fair path forward. Her words were passionate, insistent, filled with urgency. But Kennedy calmly raised a hand. "With all due respect," he said, "if taxing the rich could solve every problem, it would have done so a long time ago. You can take every dime from every billionaire in this country, and you still won't scratch the surface of this $90 trillion wish list." That line hit hard. Even the cameras caught a few heads nodding in the background. Kennedy leaned back, folding his arms now. His final words in that exchange sealed the moment. "You call it bold. I call it a burden. And I'll be damned if I sit here and pretend the folks back home can carry it without breaking." The silence that followed wasn't just thoughtful. It was heavy, almost uncomfortable. Because for the first time in the debate, AOC's soaring vision had collided head-on with Kennedy's portrait of taxpayers footing the bill. And in that chamber, reality was beginning to weigh more than rhetoric. Kennedy stacked the papers neatly in front of him, tapping the corner against the table with deliberate calm. For nearly an hour, he had read, paused, and dissected AOC's bill, without raising his voice, without grandstanding. And now, everyone in the room could sense it. He was winding toward the finish. He leaned into the microphone, his drawl steady, his eyes fixed on the chamber. "Congresswoman," he began, "I admire your conviction. I truly do. But here's the truth. Writing promises on paper is easy. Delivering on them is hard. And what I've read out loud here today isn't a roadmap. It's a mirage. The closer you get, the less real it becomes." The words hit like a slow-moving hammer. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't sneering. He was simply stating what everyone in the room could feel. He picked up the papers one last time and read, from a closing clause in the proposal, "The Green New Deal shall mobilize every aspect of American society at scale not seen since World War II." Kennedy looked up, letting the weight of the sentence hang. Then he delivered his closer, not loud, not showy, but sharp enough to cut through the air like glass. "Congresswoman, America doesn't need to be mobilized like it's going to war. It needs leaders who can tell the truth. And the truth is, this bill doesn't save us. It bankrupts us. The silence that followed was immediate, suffocating. Reporters froze, pens suspended midair. AOC opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out fast enough to meet the punch. Her allies shifted uncomfortably. Even some of her supporters, who had cheered earlier, sat stone still. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than shouting ever could. Kennedy slowly gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and slid them aside. Then, almost as an afterthought, he leaned back into the microphone with one final line, delivered with the dry humor that made him infamous. Now, I reckon some folks will still call this bold, but back where I come from, we got another word for promises you can't keep. Fairy tales. This time there was no laughter, no clapping, just a deep, uncomfortable quiet that stretched across the room like a heavy curtain. AOC adjusted her microphone, her hands twitching as if searching for the right words, the right comeback, the right defense. But Kennedy had chosen his ending perfectly. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't insulted. He had let the bill speak for itself, and then let the silence do the rest. Reporters knew instantly they had their headline. Cameras captured every angle of the moment. Kennedy's calm composure, AOC's stunned expression, the chamber frozen in awkward stillness. And outside that room, the moment would spread like wildfire. Clips of Kennedy's reading would dominate the evening news, fill timelines, and flood debates across the nation. Supporters of AOC would insist he had twisted her vision, that bold ideas always sounded impossible at first. But Kennedy's allies, and more importantly, undecided Americans watching from their living rooms, would only remember one thing: the silence. Because sometimes in politics, the most devastating argument isn't shouted. It's whispered. It's read slowly, carefully, word for word, until the truth feels undeniable. As Kennedy gathered his notes and rose from his chair, he left behind a chamber that felt like it had been struck by a storm. AOC had passion. Kennedy had patience. And on that day, patience had won. The cameras caught one last image. Kennedy walking out with his papers under his arm. Not a word wasted, not a glance backward. And that was the moment the story was written. Kennedy read AOC's bill out loud, and the room fell silent.